All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Garmin Aviation Training Team, we want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this morning. We got a lot of great information we're gonna talk about here for the next hour or so. There's definitely some unusual times going on around the country, around the world, but we're excited that we're able to do these webinars, get some information out there, and hopefully you guys will learn something valuable off this that you can take back to your aircraft, get more enjoyment out of the aircraft, more enjoyment out of the avionics, and make for safer flying out there. So uh, today we're going to be talking about approaches. We are going to be focusing on the GTN today, but when we get into some of the logic, this same logic is going to carry over from system to system. So whether you're flying 435-30s or if you fly G1000, G23, 5000, when we start talking about the logic behind one of these systems, you will see that it's going to carry over from airframe to airframe, from system to system. So definitely gives us some help there. So a lot of good stuff we're talking about, so let's go ahead and dive on in. So my name is Matt Clark. I am an aviation pilot trainer here at Garmin. I've been flying since I was 9 years old with two couch cushions and a little Cessna 150 just to savor the dash. Taught for the University of Central Missouri, taught for them for about a year. I currently teach part-time downtown at ATD Flight Systems at the Kansas City Downtown Airport. I am a commercial single and multi-engine rated pilot. I am an active CFII. Fly a lot of Skyhawks, Piper Archers, Arrows, Warriors, everything in the PA-28 series, as well as flying some Cirrus SR-22, SR-22Ts, and then my Seneca and Seminoles there. Garmin-wise, I've been here with Garmin for about the last 5 years. I actually started with our aviation product support team. So if anybody's ever called in asking database questions, usage questions, operation questions, that's what I dealt with. My claim to fame, I took a phone call on our GPS 100, the first product Garmin ever made. The very next phone call was a Lear 75 G5000. So we got very good at jumping from one product to the next, and we supported retrofit panel mounted, integrated flight decks, portables, tablet applications, the Garmin Pilot. So we jumped from product to product very, very quickly, one call to the next. After that, I have been with the aviation training team ever since. We teach GTN flight displays such as TXI, G500, 600, G3X, G3 5000, weather radar, all these different courses, all from the pilot side of things. So but we really do get to work and train behind a lot of this equipment. So enough about me. We're going to go ahead and jump in. We got a lot of information we're going to cover today. We're going to start in through selecting approaches, how we can let the GTN help us determine both weather-wise and runway-wise, what's going to be the best runway, what's the best approach that we want to shoot based on given conditions. So we'll talk about some of the tools that are already built in there, and depending on what you have installed in the aircraft, how this can help us. We'll go through actually loading an approach, loading versus activating, what's the difference between the two, when should I do one, when should I do the other. We'll talk about some special approach considerations such as DME arcs, hold in lieu of procedure turns, course reversals, all of that stuff there. We will talk a few before final approach fix action items, things that we need to do before we cross the final approach fix on that approach. We'll also talk about missed approach. Now, when we get into missed, it will vary a little bit based on the equipment that you have in your aircraft, but we're going to talk some generalities on that. And then we'll end it here with the visual approaches, how the advisory guidance on that can help us set up for a visual approach to any specified runway there. So a lot of information, but we're going to kind of plow on through here. As you run into questions during this, GoToWebinar has the questions box. If you want to do that, we've got several colleagues that are ready to answer questions for you. If you have questions, please ask. We want you to ask. For some reason we're unable to get those questions answered during this webinar, then please email us in at aviationtraining.webinar@garmin.com. That's going to come directly to the training team, and we'll be more than glad to answer those questions. That email will be in the upper right-hand corner of all the slides, so don't worry about writing it down now. If you have questions, though, please ask. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and jump on in first and foremost with selecting the approach. As we start into this, we need to understand a little bit of where the system is pulling the approach information from. I've taken a few phone calls on this. Whenever you load an approach into a Garmin device, whether it's a 430, 530, GTN, G1, 5000, all that data is coming from the navigation database. For those that run a GTN 750 or if those run a G1000 that has a chart database, that is a separate independent database. Those are just simply digital copies of those approach plates. The actual information that what the system is using to provide navigation is from the nav database itself. Now the GTN is going to provide your primary vertical and lateral guidance for GPS approaches. It's also going to provide you situational awareness for ILS, localizer, VORs, and the beloved NDB approaches. So even though we have to be on raw nav data, we have to be on VLOC or running green needles if you're using a Garmin HSI, we can still use that for appropriate nav guidance, or for situational awareness, excuse me. If we take a look at AIM 1-2-3, there's a section in there talking about the suitable uses of RNAV systems. So in there, we can use it to determine aircraft position. We've got a three-dimensional GPS fix, so we can look on the map page, we know exactly where we are. We can use it to track to, from, VORs, TACANs, NDBs, compass locators. So we can fly to a VOR, fly from a VOR. We can fly Victor Airways, jet routes, any sort of airways using GPS guidance. We don't have to run the raw nav data as we're doing that. Same thing for holding. I can hold over a VOR, TACAN, NDB, so on and so forth. So for those with GTN and G1000, we can create that hold, add it into the flight plan, and let the system do the hard work for us there. We can use it to fly published DME arcs. So if we're shooting an approach that has a DME arc in it, we can let the GTN, or the same for the GNS, same for the 1000, let that system do the hard work and give us all that guidance around. So all that is within AIM 1-2-3, and then we can even get into a little bit of alternate filing, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, some exceptions on where we cannot use GPS is if we're trying to shoot, say, like a VOR approach or an ILS or a localizer. By the time we hit the final approach fix inbound, we need to be referencing that ground-based nav source, unless the approach plate itself says GPS. So if it's a VOR or GPS approach, then we can run GPS. If it's a VOR only or an ILS or localizer only approach, then by the time we hit the final approach fix, we need to be running raw nav data. That we need to be on VLOC, or make sure on our Garmin HSIs we're on green needles. If you do decide to shoot the GPS approach, you will see one of a number of enunciations, which you can kind of see on the left-hand side there. Whether it's LNAV, VNAV, providing lateral and vertical nav guidance for the approach, LNAV only, meaning we're just getting lateral guidance, LNAV plus V, LPV, LP plus V. By the time I get up to the final approach fix, I should see one of those as an enunciation on my GTN. I want to make sure I see one of those options. If I don't, something didn't sequence properly. Another thing I like to point out here is anything with a plus V. Anytime you see a plus V on a Garmin system, that is an advisory vertical guidance, advisory vertical glide path. It does not necessarily take into account altitude step downs. There is an approach out in the Kansas City area I make all of my students fly because it does cut the corner of that step down altitude. It can still be a great and wonderful tool. It can still be useful to help create a more stabilized glide path all the way down. But you as the pilot are ultimately responsible to make sure you are in compliance with all the required altitude step downs. Now, there are definitely some advantages of a GPS approach compared to, say, an ILS, a localizer, definitely a VOR approach. Modern SBAS, modern satellite-based augmentation, is extremely reliable. This is a chart we pulled from last year between January and March, showing you the availability of LPV approaches around the country, and the lowest it ever really went was 99.99% availability. That is absolutely phenomenal. This definitely allows for an easier transition. So as we're coming en route, we're probably on GPS, we're following GPS course guidance. As we get into the approach phase, we're not worried about IDing a nav, dialing in a frequency, making sure we swapped from GPS to VLOC. It's all staying GPS, so it's going to decrease the amount of error that we could potentially run into. It's also going to reduce the risk of having some sort of a signal disturbance if you're trying to fly an ILS or localizer. Second chart here showing similar things, kind of showing a 15-minute window for an LPV WAAS approach. The lowest one there, I want to say, was Puerto Vallarta there, and it was at 99.93% availability. So very, very accurate, very reliable. That being said, I still fly ILSs all the time. I still fly VOR approaches all the time. They still have their place. They're still valuable approaches. But all things to consider when you're selecting what type of approach that you want to fly. Some other tools that the GTN is going to bring to us. One option here is you get into the approach section in the flight plan or in the GTN. We do have a couple shortcuts. So before I pick the approach, before I pick the transition, I can actually go and hit that charts button down at the bottom, and I can pull up the approach plate where I can get ceilings, my visibilities. I can make sure that what I'm getting ready to fly, I can actually do, that the weather is going to be good enough for me to do that approach. From here, we have another shortcut as well. I can go and hit the airport information button, which is going to take me over to my waypoint information. And in here, in a sense, we can do an airport briefing. If you're getting data link weathers through FISB weather, XM weather, or if you're outside those areas but you're running a GSR 56 and you're getting Connect weather, you can show the METARs, you can show the TAF data for that airport, and you can have an idea of what to expect, what type of approach you should be doing well in advance before you get into that terminal phase and you start getting bogged down with a lot of other tasks. But here, we check the weather. We can even load frequencies, get those preloaded, so when we get into that terminal environment, there's one less thing for us to have to deal with. We can brief runway distances, links, traffic pattern, I mean, you name it. The information we need for that airport is all right here. Whatever we need, we can get that information, and we can use all of that to make an appropriate selection for our approach. Once we do that, now we've got a better idea of what approach we should be doing, what the weather's doing. Then we can take into account geometry. Where are we coming from? Where are the initial approach fixes for that particular approach? And now we can use it to make a better decision as to which initial fix we want to grab, which one we want to use. In this case, we're over the MCI VOR. That happens to be one of the initial fixes. That's a perfect fix for us. So we can do that, load up the approach, and go. For those that are running the GTN 6XX series, the 650s or 650XI, or as well as the GPS, the 155, GNX 375, GNC 355, we don't have a chart database in there. We don't have that one. So for that, we're going to use our tablets, or we're going to use a paper chart, another means of charts to determine that. But we still have the waypoint information. I can still go into waypoint information. I can still figure out what my weather's going to be for that airport. I can figure out landing and distance, or not landing distances, but I can figure out runway lengths and widths. I can figure out frequencies. I can still pull all that required information, and I can do that well ahead of time. And then from there, same thing as the other, go back into procedures, and then I can make an appropriate selection when we get into the approach. All right, so now let's get into actually loading up the approach. Now there's a number of different ways you can do it. When you're loading an approach, I have a couple ways that I prefer that I do on a consistent basis. I recommend you all do the same thing. When you get out to the aircraft, figure out the habit pattern, the most effective way that you're going to load these approaches, and do it consistently every single time the same way. It's going to minimize any chance of errors that you're going to have as you start loading these approaches. First and foremost, probably my preferred way to do it is directly off the flight plan page. So in this case, Topeka, Philip Builder is our destination airport. If I tap on the airport in the flight plan, it's going to bring up my airport options menu, or waypoint option menu, excuse me. And from there, I can load procedures. So I can load arrivals, departures. In this case, we're going to be focusing on the approach. So a very quick, easy way to do that. I always have the ability, I can press the home button on the GTN and I can go and select procedures right in the middle of the screen. And then my third, probably my second most favorite way to load up an approach on a GTN is changing one of the data fields on the map page. These, unlike say a 430 or 530, these are not just limited to information. These are we can select pages, and have essentially shortcuts to that page. In this case, we've got a procedure in one corner and I've got an approach in another. So if I'm going to be doing repeat approaches over and over and over, I might as well go ahead and set one of those corners to an approach. So now I've got a shortcut to load approaches, and I'm going to minimize my heads down time in the aircraft. It's going to save you a lot of time. When it comes to data fields, I'm the type of pilot that I will change my data fields on a per flight basis based on what I think is going to be the most critical or what information I want to get to the fastest. So these are two very great options. Now, being standard Garmin logic, flight plan wise, we can have one flight plan or one approach loaded in the flight plan at any given time. One approach only. One arrival, one departure, one approach. The exception to that is if you have to go missed. If you go missed, once you get to the missed approach hold, I can load up an alternate approach without removing the missed approach hold. So I can sit in that hold. I can stay there as long as I need to, so I can load up a new approach, brief the new procedure, and then I can move on from there. And there we can see an approach loaded at the end of the flight plan. Now the GTN is going to default to the destination airport when you get to the procedure page. In this case, Topeka was my destination. So when I go to procedures and into the approach chapter or approach page here, Topeka is automatically pre-populated. This is Garmin logic though. I see that it's a cyan color and I see that it's in a box. So when I see those two things, it means I can tap on that box and I can always change the airport to an alternate airport if I need to. Remember that one. Cyan means I can change it. Or if I'm doing an off-route direct to, I hit direct to, I'm going to an airport that's not in the flight plan. When I come over to my approach page, I will automatically see the airport pre-populated in there for me. And once we do that, we select the right airport, then we get to select the best approach or whatever approach we want to do. It's going to list out everything that it has in the nav database, ILS, a back course. When it comes down to the GPS approaches, take an example, the RNAV 04. It's already telling me right next to that, it's showing an LNAV plus V. It says based on the current GPS geometry satellite acquisition, it wants to give me an LNAV plus V. That's something I can expect. Same thing for the RNAV 13 or RNAV 18. They're both showing LPV. I'm anticipating flying an LPV approach. This is also a great tool for flight instructors out there. When I'm flying around with students, I've seen a lot of flight instructors that are forcing their students to fly LNAV only approaches. They'll go in and they'll turn their SBAS off. Well, 9 out of 10 times they forget to turn it back on. So when I go up with my students, we're starting to load the approach. Suddenly, when I'm expected to see an LPV, all I see is an LNAV. That tells me something's not quite right. That says I can go back into my system and make sure that SBAS is actually turned on, and then we can go from there. So great tool, great way to anticipate what type of approach you're going to be doing. Now, one difference compared to, say, a 430, 530 or the G1000 is that of the transition. 430, 530s, G1000s, when you're going into the approach, it makes you pick a transition, whether it's vectors to final, whether you're picking an initial transition, initial approach fix. The GTN differs from that, and it defaults to vectors. So it makes an assumption you are going to get vectored along to your final approach course. You may or may not be doing that. So if you need to change a transition, we're going to tap on transitions, and then we can choose whether it's and it's going to have, our list options are going to be any of the published transitions, as well as any, as well as the vectors to final. Older software versions, and say the 430, 530s, if you loaded vectors to final, that would be the last waypoint really in the flight plan. You wouldn't show any other fixes before the final approach fix. Downside to this is, you're expecting vectors, you loaded vectors, and then all of a sudden ATC told you to go to an intermediate fix. It's not in the flight plan, so you now got to go back, reload the approach, pick the transition, and then go from there. You're in a terminal environment, there's a lot going on, not a great spot to be in. With GTN 6.0 and newer, as well as all the GTN XIs, is any fix that is on the final approach course will be added in the flight plan. Now, the final approach fix is still the active waypoint, but I still have anything that's on that course. Now, if there's a T intersection or if there's a dog leg feeding in, those waypoints won't be in the flight plan. So a recommendation the training team always gives, pick an appropriate transition. Pick a transition that's going to make the most sense based on where you're coming from. It's always easier to pick a transition initially and then swap over to vectors to final. Here in just a little bit, we'll show you how you can do that. It's always easier to do that than it is to go from vectors to final back to a transition. That involves reloading the approach. The other one, it's a button press. So pick a transition and go from there. So one spot that I see pilots get hung up with quite a bit is loading the approach versus loading and activating. What's the difference there? Well, loading the approach, in this case, we're taking the RNAV 3.6 into Topeka. I picked Zudkey as my initial transition. If I load the approach, that is simply going to place that procedure at the end of my flight plan. Whatever route I'm still currently flying is still going to stay. So if I'm en route, I'm expecting the approach, I can load it, I can have it ready. Versus if I load and activate the approach, same transition. Notice how I'm now going direct to Zudkey. Zudkey is my active waypoint. Whatever else in my flight plan, the system doesn't care about anymore. I'm going directly to that fix. Or in the case of vectors to final, it's going to go ahead and draw out that final approach course for me. So it depends on what we're doing. A couple of rules of thumb we have. If you hear ATC say expect, in this case expect the RNAV 3.6, I'm going to load the approach, put it at the end of my flight plan. If I hear the words cleared for, I hear a lot of people say, well, activate the approach. I go a little bit more specific than that. We're going to say verify that your approach is active. Well, we have a number of ways to determine if our approach is active. First and foremost, I can activate the approach. So inside the flight plan, if I tap the approach bar, right here, which is approach KTOP RNAV 3.6, if I tap that bar, I can go into approach options and I can activate the approach. That's now going to take me directly to the initial approach fix, or if I loaded vectors, it's going to activate the final approach course. This is also where we can go and activate vectors to final. So if we picked the transition, we started coming into the approach, and then we realized ATC was actually going to vector us to the final approach course, I can go and activate vectors to final and continue flying just fine. Same thing, options apply if you go into home and then over to the procedure. You have activate approach, and you have activate vectors to final. Probably my most commonly used method is creating a direct to a fix on the approach. So in this case, they said proceed direct to Zudkey. Tap Zudkey, tap direct to, off I go. That activating a direct to a fix on the approach will sequence through the approach. The one caveat I'm going to give is if you're doing this, if you try to go direct to the final approach fix. Off the final approach fix, there's a 45-degree cone. If you're inside that cone, you can go direct to, it'll cycle properly for you. If you're outside of that cone, however, you're not going to get your vertical guidance. It's not going to sequence quite right. It's not going to give you the right CDI scalings. It's not going to do what you're expecting to do. Typically, I never advise anybody go direct to the final approach fix. I'm either going to pick an intermediate fix to go direct to, pick an initial fix to go direct to, or the other option, I can activate a leg on the approach. So for example, if I wanted to intercept between Zudkey and Wasmo, I can tap Wasmo, I can activate the leg, and I can intercept anywhere in between those two waypoints, and I know the system is going to go ahead and sequence properly. Now, being that Garmin runs a linear flight plan, when you load up an approach, it places it at the end of the flight plan. If I get direct to my destination, I don't ever activate the approach. As soon as I get to that to my destination, then the next waypoint is the initial transition, and it's going to then cycle all the way through for me there. So it is going to work one waypoint after the other. If we need to go in and for whatever reason we need to change a transition, typically going to say don't modify it off the flight plan. Don't go in and delete out waypoints, add waypoints back in. And it may not put it in the right sequence. It may not label it as an initial, as a final. It may not give you proper scaling. Also, I'm not going to remove the old approach. As we've already said, we can only have one approach in the system at a time. So all I need to do, I can go in, select the approach, and now I can make whatever change I need to make, whether it's a different airport, whether it's a different transition, whether it's a different approach altogether. I can make all those changes, and then I can load and activate as appropriate, and the system is going to replace the approach with the new one I've loaded up here. If we need to push the vectors to final again, so as we said, we're getting vectored in after all, tap the approach bar, activate vectors to final, and we can intercept and continue in on the approach. All right, so a couple special approach considerations to think about. First one here is course reversals, or hold in lieu of procedure terms. So I'm going to put my laser pointer, and everything we're doing here, we're based off the fact we're going to try to go to the intersection right there called FECM. So if I'm going to that center intersection, that center initial approach fix, anything on the left-hand side of that red line, we know ATC is expecting us to do, and we're required to do that course reversal. We got to get turned around somehow. So if we load the flight plan up, we load the procedure up, the system isn't going to ask me if I want to do that course reversal. It's just going to do it. It's going to automatically place that course reversal into my flight plan, and so I've got that guidance there. Anything on the right side of that line, however, is completely optional. If I wanted to, I can go straight into FECM, and then I can go ahead and continue in on the approach. I don't need to do the hold. There may be situations you need to, there may be not. But anywhere where it says optional there, when I load up that approach, it's going to give me this message right here. Do you want to fly the course reversal? Probably 90% of the time, I want to hit no. I want to hit that intermediate or that middle initial fix, and I want to continue in on the approach. That being said, there could be cases where you need to do the course reversal, or you need to do that hold. There could be somebody else on the approach ahead of you, and ATC says yes, and you're going to need to hold here. In which case, that could be a yes. I ran into a scenario where as the pilot, selected yes. I was flying into Omaha, had a storm cell sitting right over my destination airport. It was moving pretty fast, but I needed to give that storm just a little bit more time. So I told ATC I need to hold at this fix. I selected yes, did a couple turns in the hold. Storm cell moved out far enough that I was able to go ahead and then come in on the rest of the approach. So a couple scenarios where you may have to do the approach, whether it's pilot side or ATC driven. So in this case here, we're coming in, the system's already determined we've got to do the approach for the course reversal based on the angle we're coming in at. And typically what it's going to do, as we come up to it, you're going to see, as you see on the screenshot here, it's going to tell us the type of hold entry it wants us to do. In this case, it's trying to give us a parallel entry, whether it's parallel, teardrop, direct, whatever entry it is, it's going to tell us. It does the hard work for us. And as soon as I cross that waypoint, notice what I see on the map page. All I see is the course reversal. I don't see the rest of the hold. So the system is going to do the course reversal. It's going to get me established inbound, and then we're going to continue in on the approach. That's assuming I don't press anything. I don't do anything else. That's unless ATC tells us to, or unless we decide to. That's what they're anticipating us doing. Down at the bottom on the GTN, notice our OBS button has been replaced with a suspend button. So at any point, if I need to stay in that hold, if I hit that button, notice how the rest of the hold now appears on the map. So that's a visual clue that I'm going to do that hold. I can also look down at the bottom of the GTN and I see a suspend annunciation, SUSP, meaning I have stopped waypoint sequencing. Big clues. And then I can also see in the red box there, suspend has been replaced with unsuspend. So now I'm going to stay in this hold until I hit unsuspend. Once I'm ready to come inbound, whether I'm cleared by ATC, whether I tell them I'm ready to come in, I hit unsuspend. It's going to finish out the rest of the hold, get me established inbound on the final approach course, and the hold's going to drop off again. I'm going to come in. This time I'll cross back over, in this case, WASMO, and proceed inbound on the rest of the approach. So ways that we can kind of control if we stay in the hold, if we don't. Now, initial approach fix through the procedure turn outbound, we can use GPS. We can use our nav on this. If anyone ever comes to our instructor-led training, you'll hear me say this all the time, I'm lazy. If the system's going to do something for me, I'm going to let it do it. In this case, if I've got roll steering capable autopilot or a Garmin autopilot, I'm going to let the autopilot do the hard work. I can focus on either briefing anything, doing any last-minute checklist, anything else that I need to do, because I know the system's going to take care of it. Procedure turn inbound for VOR approaches, I can still use GPS. So I'm still tracking, I can track that inbound, and we're good. For localizer and ILS, by the time I get myself established inbound, I want to be on green needles or on VLOC as early as possible. I want to be running that raw nav data. I want to make sure I'm tracking the proper course. Now, unless the approach says or GPS, or it says GPS in the title, by the time we hit the FAF, the final approach fix, down to the mist, we need to be running that raw nav data. So if you're shooting an ILS, you're shooting a VOR, by the time I get to the final approach fix, be running green needles, be running on VLOC, and you're in good shape. All right, DME ARCs. For those that still fly DME ARCs, the GTN will provide guidance for published ARCs. I can't manually create a DME ARC to let the GTN fly. I'm still that mean flight instructor that makes my students fly those by hand. But if the ARC is part of a published procedure, then I'm going to let the GTN give me some help. So in this case, we can do this a couple different ways. I can select one of the initial fixes, such as there's a fix over on this side and one on the others, 2 initial fixes. I can pick one of those fixes when I'm loading up my transition, and the system will treat it like any other approach. It's another leg, it's another initial approach fix. The other option is to activate and intercept the ARC. So if we're outside of the ARC, I can activate that leg as early as I want. I can then come in, intercept it, and then fly it just like any other leg, treat it like a standard intercept. The limitation, however, is if you're inside the ARC. We need to be at least half the distance to that ARC before I can activate that particular leg. So for example, if I'm flying a 10 DME ARC, I need to be within at least 5 miles of the ARC before I can activate that leg. So a couple scenarios here. Here, we're being told to fly directly to the IAF, the initial fix, and we're going to fly the entire approach. So we're flying direct, in this case, the intersection to Cumji. I'll fly direct to that fix, we'll fly the entire arc, and then come inbound on the approach. Pretty straightforward there. However, if we get to something like this, an ATC instruction of either intercept the arc at the nearest point or fly heading 255 to intercept the arc. We're heading mode, nav mode's armed, all of that. We can go in this case, on the 750 here, I'm going to tap that bar right there. Takes me over to my flight plan page, and notice how in the flight plan there's 7 DME ARC based off the Topeka VOR, taking us to, in this case, Demary, the Demary intersection. So I'll tap on Demary, I'll tap activate leg up at the top, and I'll get this prompt. Sure you want to activate this leg? Yes. So we'll hit OK. So it's Topeka 7 DME to Demary, we hit OK, and now I can see on the map page itself, the entire arc is now magenta. That's the active leg. I can intercept anywhere along that leg, and I'm going to have proper sequencing, proper guidance all the way through the rest of the approach. Like we talked about earlier, I activated a leg on the approach. My approach is active. It will cycle and sequence properly for me. So a couple things to think about there. So now let's come into a few items we need to talk about prior to coming up to the final approach fix. First and foremost, make sure the nav aid frequency is in the active. When you load up an approach, an ILS, a VOR, localizer, whatever type of approach, when you load it up on the GTN, same as the GNS 43530s, it's going to place that frequency into standby. It does it automatically for us. It never puts it to active. So my advice to you, if you're flying, in this case, we're en route, we're on GPS guidance, I've loaded the approach, the immediate next action we should do is go ahead and push that frequency into the active. In this case, this is for the ILS 19 at Kansas City downtown. So 109.9 is active. Now that we've got it in the active frequency, we need to verify that nav aid. For older systems, we're used to going in, turning the audio panel on, breaking the squelch on the nav radio, and listening to the Morse code. With GTN, with G1000, we can actually let the system do the hard work for us. Once again, I'm lazy. The system's going to do some work for me. If I look at the nav frequency box, I notice there's two sets of letters. There's letters above the frequency and there's letters below. Letters below the frequency are what we call reverse frequency lookup. That's a guess. GTN is saying based on the frequency you dialed in and based on your GPS position, I'm pretty sure this is the frequency you dialed up. And it does a pretty good job of guessing. However, the letters above the frequency are actually the GTN taking that Morse code and decoding it. So if I see it above, it's listened to Morse code, it's decoded it into plain text for us, it's positively identified that nav aid, and that is a legal identification. If I see the letters above my frequency, I'm in good shape. So nav aid's good, we verified it, it's activated, the approach is loaded. We need to make sure now we've got the correct nav source selected. Obviously, if we're flying a GPS approach and we're already on GPS, great, I don't have to do anything. I'm going to let the system continue flying. If you're going to fly a VOR or a localizer back course, that does require a manual switch. I either hit the CDI button on my GTN or hit change my CDI source on my PFD if I'm on a different Garmin flight display. Those running ILS, localizer, SDF, LDAs, the system is capable of auto switch. Now, auto switch may or may not be available in your aircraft. It's going to depend and vary based on your installation. Always refer to your aircraft flight manual supplement as to whether it is or not. But if all the conditions are met, you've got auto switch turned on. If you go to the home page, go into system, go into setup, there isn't, if it's enabled, you can turn auto switch on. If you got the approach loaded, frequency in the active, then the system does have the ability to switch. However, if you're too close to the final approach fix, you will get an alert. It'll ask you, you'll get a CDI source message telling you, hey, the GTN saying you need to switch your source. You're a little bit too close in. I don't think you're on the right nav source. So it's trying to give you a little bit of a heads up before we get to the final approach fix. If you're going to let the auto switch happen, there is a box. There's a window of where it will and where it will not switch. So you need to be at least 2 nautical miles from the final approach fix, out to 15 nautical miles, and then 1.2 nautical miles either side of the final approach course. So if you're outside of that box, the system will not auto switch. So if ATC brings you in really close to the final approach fix, then it's up to you as a pilot to change that CDI source. Or if they intercept you to a localizer beyond 15 miles, then just bear in mind the system isn't going to auto switch until you get a little bit closer. I typically treat the auto switch as a backup. I like to manually control my my CDI source, but it is a great tool there and it is a great backup for us. So nav aid frequency is active. We're on the right nav source. We need to set the inbound course on our HSI or CDI, depending on what we're running. If you're running a Garmin HSI, we know it's going to automatically slew for us, so it takes a little bit of work out for us. We're then going to determine an appropriate minimum. So take a look at the chart based on aircraft category, what MINs are going to apply, which ones don't. And if you're running a Garmin primary flight display, such as a G500, G600, TXI, G3X, then I can go in on my PFD and set that minimum on the display itself. If you're able to, never a bad idea to go ahead and brief downgraded approach mids. So if you lost a glide slope off an ILS, all right, you can still continue coming in as a localizer approach. Or if you lost WAAS or lost SBAS, then potentially based on where you lose signal, we may still be able to continue the approach. If you're coming up prior to the final approach fix and for some reason we lose WAAS, we lose SBAS, you're going to get an approach downgrade message. It's going to go from LPV or LNAV VNAV, and it's going to downgrade to an LNAV approach. You're going to get a message on that. You're also going to see your CDI scaling change. So as you come up to the final approach fix, something to keep in your scan is that CDI scaling. If you're inside of the final approach fix coming down on the approach, the system is and you lose GPS for whatever reason, or we lose WAAS, then we're going to tell you to abort approach. Something's happened, we don't know what. Abort, get out of there, go missed, and then either come back around, pick a different approach, or pick one with ground-based nav. Start troubleshooting from there if you need to. The idea is, if you're inbound on the approach, you're starting your descent, if something happens, abort, go missed. Some more logic here. Typically, by at least 2 nautical miles from the FAF, the GTN is going to enunciate what type of minimums it's planning. Typically, I'm going to see this well before that. It's usually when the final approach fixes the active waypoint. And I can see down at the bottom, there's my GTN, showing me there's an LPV. If I'm running a Garmin HSI, then I'll see that as part of my HSI enunciations. So as you're coming up to the FAF, pay attention to one of these. Make sure that by the time you cross the final approach fix, you still have that same CDI source or CDI scaling. Great thing to keep in your instrument scan. 30 seconds out from the final approach fix, GTN is going to do a HAL and VAL check, horizontal alarm and vertical alarm check. It's its own internal checks, making sure that the GPS signal is within tolerance, within its own limits. If it's not, that's when you're going to see that approach downgrade. Then you can either continue as a non-precision or tell approach, hey, I need to come back around, brief it as an LNAV, whatever the situation may be. So, recap here. Nav aid's in the active. We're on the right nav source. We've set and verified our inbound course and our HSIs or CDIs. We've determined the appropriate approach minimum. We've set mins on our PFD if appropriate. We've briefed downgraded mins. A couple recommendations. For a non-precision approach, like an LNAV only or a VOR approach, I like to bug my MDA, my minimum descent altitude. When I do that, I see that as a hard limit. I know I'm not going to go below that bug. If I'm flying a precision approach, an LPV and ILS, I actually bug my missed approach altitude. Because when I get to decision altitude, I'm going to take a look outside the aircraft. I either have my cloud and visibility or I don't. If I don't, missed approach, power up, clean up, go around. Then we go from there. As I start cleaning up the aircraft, one less thing I have to do is to rebug my missed approach altitude. It's already set. So keep that in mind, just options. Last one, when ATC has cleared us for the approach, verify the approach is active. We know that if we go direct to a fix on the approach, we've activated a leg, vectors defined on any of those, we're going to verify that we are sequencing our waypoints in the approach, verify that that is active. Missed approach-wise, system's going to do a number of things, but first and foremost, as we cross over the missed approach point, the system is automatically going to put us into suspend. It's going to stop waypoint sequencing. We make the assumption you intend to land the aircraft. Until you tell it otherwise, it's going to stay suspended. For those students that are out there, as soon as that message pops up, if you're going to land, the last thing you should be doing is touching the screen. At this point, especially if we're flying an LPV or an ILS, we're 200, 250 feet off the ground, my focus should be outside the aircraft, getting the aircraft ready to land. The system's going to stay. We can hold off and pressing anything on the box. If we're going to go missed, you're going to power up, clean up, and then we can activate, in this case, activate the GPS missed approach. It will once you hit that button, it will switch you back into GPS. So if you're already on Green Eagles, if you're on VLOC, it will switch you back into GPS, and we're going to fly the missed approach under GPS guidance. Now for those flying ILSs and LPVs, the missed approach point in the GTN in the nav database is a different point than the decision altitude. So if you get to DA, you luck out, you have what you need, or if you don't, you're going to start going missed. You'll power up, clean up, start climbing out. Once you're not going to see anything happen on the display until you cross the physical missed approach point. So keep that in mind, be patient with it, it will pop up on us. And then cycle you into the mist. Some instances, some installs, if you don't have an altitude source feeding in, you may get this prompt right here where it's giving you an altitude. Some missed approaches have an altitude constraint. As in climb to the X altitude, turn to a heading, or climb to an altitude, fly to X waypoint. if you have an altitude source being fed in, like a G500, G5, TXI, G3X, that altitude information is being fed to the GTN. The system knows when you get to that altitude, so it doesn't prompt this. If you don't, if you're flying GTN only, or GTN without an altitude source, we don't know when you get to that altitude. So I hit activate GPS missed, immediately get met with a second prompt. So in this case, I'm going to fly a course of 072. Once I pass 1,800 feet, then I'm going to go ahead, I will unsuspend again, and now it will continue on with the rest of my missed approach. So it's going to vary based on what you have in the system. Couple of rules of diverting, or if you need to divert to a new airfield, once you get to that missed approach hold, we can load up that new approach without removing the missed approach hold. So we can get into the hold, we can stay there, we can fly it. We have an autopilot that's capable of flying those roll steering legs. I want to set my autopilot back on. Now I can brief a new approach, load up a new approach, and still stay in that hold until I'm ready or until ATC clears me. Thing to think about though, if they give you a little more of a complicated reroute to your diversion airport, is the way a Garmin flight plan works. We have a departure section in the flight plan, we have an en route section, we have an arrival, and we have an approach section. I'm not going to be able to load an airway into an approach section of the flight plan. So if they do give me an airway to go fly, I either need to go back into my en route section or delete out the approach. I need to do some flight plan work there, so then I can add that in there. If you're able though, if you can get direct to the airfield, to your diversion airfield, do so. Set direct to. Now then we can load up the new approach. As we've said, we're doing an off-route direct to, so when I go into my approach page, that's the airport that's going to pre-populate and simplify some work for me. Set direct to, load the procedures, off we go. All right, last little bit, and that's going to be about all the time I have for us today. I'm just going to be talking about our visual approaches. Now, just what it says, approaches. It is intended to be used in VMC, visual conditions. This is providing advisory lateral and advisory vertical guidance to a specified runway. Question I get all the time is, well, why don't I just load up a GPS approach and fly the approach in? That is always an option for us. But not every airport out there has an instrument approach. As long as we have a published threshold crossing height, we can create a visual approach. We can create lateral and vertical guidance to a specific runway. So this can help us creating a more stabilized approach and get us lined up with the proper runway. As long as we have that threshold crossing height, we can create it, and it is available for most of the runways in the database. So there are a number of different ways we can load up an approach. I'm going to talk about 3. My personal favorite on the GTN is, in this case, tap on the airport itself. So I tap on the airport. In this case, I'm selecting KLXT, or Least Summit. And as soon as I do that, down at the bottom, I see a visual approach icon. I can tap visual and pick whatever approach I want, whichever runway I need to go to. Great, easy, simple option. Doesn't get much simpler than that. Typically, the GTN will default if typically within 10 miles of my destination airport. The lower left-hand corner is going to replace whatever data field is there. It's going to get replaced with a visual approach icon. The GTN defaults to 10 miles, but this is a customizable option. I can set that to, say, 5 miles, 2.5 miles, or I can make it longer if I want to see it earlier. I can also turn it off. I'm one of the pilots. I will actually go into my GTN. I will turn that option off, because if I put something there, whatever data was there, I put it there for a reason. So I like to see it, but these are options you can play with. Play around with it. Go into your map settings and play with it. See what you guys like, what you want, what you don't want. Third option here, I can load a visual approach just like any other instrument approach. Exactly what we've been talking about this entire time. Go into procedures, go into approach. Notice how there's an RNAV 3.6 for Least Summit, there's the VOR DME Alpha, and then beneath all of them are all of my visual approaches. And I have the same options. I can load and activate. So treat this just the same. If you're on that IFR flight plan, ATC comes up, hey, expect visual of the 3. Fantastic. I will go into my flight plan, I will go into my procedures here, and I'm going to load the visual approach. So you're continuing that consistent habit pattern. And when you load up the approach, it's going to create a 28 nautical mile final approach course, and there's only one waypoint on there at 3 nautical miles. Think of it as a final approach fix. Now, unlike a GPS approach where the vertical guidance isn't active until the final approach fix is active, I've got vertical guidance starting 28 nautical miles out. So if I'm high enough and I intercept that course, I can couple to and follow that vertical guidance all the way down to the runway. As far as third-party autopilots are concerned, a visual approach is simply a GPS approach. So I can couple, if I can couple to a GPS approach, I can couple to a visual approach. And I've got that guidance all the way out starting at 28 miles. Now when I load and activate the approach, it is going to give me a little bit of information. It's always going to give me the glide path. Typically, we're going to default to a 3-degree glide path, but we can play with that a little bit. If there's an approach that's been tested for that runway and it's 3.1 degrees, then we're going to default to that. We're going to default to what's known and what's safe. We're also going to show you the the threshold crossing height the system's working with. So we've got both pieces of information there at all times. Once again, as you activate this approach, remember, this is strictly advisory. Don't try to fly a visual approach in IFR or IMC conditions. We are not guaranteeing you obstacle. We're not guaranteeing you terrain. We do a number of things to help with that, but don't fly a visual approach in IMC. Don't do it. Now, a couple times where we will not give you any vertical guidance. If there's an obstacle or terrain within 3 nautical miles along the path, we're going to give you the message to what you see on the screen here. No vertical guidance. We can't guarantee you safety. We're not going to give you any guidance. That being said, if there's obstacles between that 28-mile mark and that 3-mile fix, if there's obstacles somewhere along there, we're going to start the vertical guidance after that point. So for example, there's an obstacle 15 miles from the end of the airport. Before that 15-mile mark, we're not giving you any vertical guidance because we know it's going to take you into an obstacle or terrain. We don't want to do that. However, once we're clear, we'll actually start giving you that guidance. So it is a little bit dynamic depending on the region, depending on what's around there. Now for this to work, we need a valid terrain and we need a valid obstacle. So I didn't say it had to be current, it needs to be valid. So for those that don't update their obstacle database very often, this updates every 56 days. If you go a year without updating it, well, we're building this off of information from whenever you loaded that database. So that reason alone mandates that this has to be visual. Now, regardless if we don't provide any vertical guidance, we are going to provide lateral guidance all the way down. So we will help you get lined up with the runway. At that point, you're on your own. You're responsible for your own vertical guidance down. So great tool, great resource. I use the heck out of this. All right, and that's going to kind of bring us up to the end of the day. As always, if you liked what you've seen here and you want more training, please explore more at flygarmin.com/training. We've got e-learning courses for the GTN. We've got instructor-led courses for GTNs, flight displays, as well as the G1, 3, 5000. If you want more specific training on those systems, look at our catalog or send us a request, and we'll be more than glad to work with you there. If you do have any other questions, though, I'm going to keep this webinar up for a little bit longer here. If you do have questions, continue using that GoToWebinar. But as always, use that aviationtraining.webinar@garmin.com, and we'll be more than glad to get an answer back to you. So, as I said, we'll keep this up for just a little bit longer to let you get those last second questions in. And thank you guys for everybody for attending this. It's been a pleasure talking with you all, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.